The air in the diner didn't just go cold when Viktor Petrov walked in. It stopped moving. Most people in this city saw the silver Fang as a ghost story or a death sentence. But as he slid into table 4, I only saw him as a late-night order and a potential headache. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a king who had grown bored of his throne, neatly combed gray hair, a suit that cost more than my college tuition, and a smirk that felt like a predator tasting the air. Behind him stood 2 walls of muscle and black suits, their hands folded, eyes scanning the room for threats. They were looking for guns. They weren't looking for me. I walked over, my white blouse crisp and my black apron tied tight. I didn't rush, and I didn't hesitate. I just clicked my pen. "Coffee's fresh, but the pie is yesterday's," I said, my voice as steady as a heart monitor. "What can I get you, Mr. Petrov?" The bodyguard stiffened. Nobody used his name unless they were begging for their lives. Viktor didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, a receipt with something scrawled on the back in thick, black ink. He didn't hand it to me. He placed it on the grease-stained table and slid it forward with one manicured finger. "Read it," he whispered, his voice like silk over gravel. "I dare you. Here is the thing about power. It only works if the other person is afraid." I looked at the note. Then I looked him dead in the eye, my hands clasped neatly in front of me. I didn't reach for the paper. I didn't even blink. "I'm on the clock, sir," I replied. "And I don't read fiction for free." The silence following my refusal was heavy, the kind of silence that usually preceded a gunshot or a glass shattering. One of the bodyguards, the one with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, took a predatory step forward. He leaned into my personal space, his shadow swallowing the light from the overhead lamp. He smelled of expensive tobacco and cold rain. "You have no idea who you're talking to, girl," he growled, his voice a low vibration that made the nearby sugar shakers rattle. "Pick up the paper. Read it. Now." I didn't back up. I didn't even look at him. My focus remained entirely on the task at hand. I reached for the white ceramic mug I'd brought on my tray and placed it precisely in front of Viktor Petrov. I poured the coffee, dark, steaming, and smelling of roasted beans, stopping exactly a quarter-inch from the rim. My hand was a statue. "Sugar is in the dispenser. Cream is in the small pitcher," I said, my voice cutting through the bodyguard's threat like a cool breeze through a fever. "And my name isn't Girl. It's Hannah. If you're not ordering, sir, I'll have to ask you to step back. You're blocking the walkway for other customers." The bodyguard's face turned a dangerous shade of red, his hand twitching toward the lapel of his jacket. The air in the diner felt like a stretched rubber band, seconds away from snapping. But before he could move, a sharp, metallic sound rang out. Viktor had tapped his signet ring against the tabletop. A single, clear clink. The bodyguard froze instantly, his aggression evaporating into a rigid, military stance. He retreated into the shadows behind the booth without another word. Viktor was looking at me now, really looking at me. His gray eyes weren't cold. They were curious, bright with a flicker of something that looked dangerously like amusement. He picked up the spoon and stirred his coffee, the silver swirling in the black liquid. He still hadn't touched the note. It sat there between us, a small white rectangle of chaos that I refused to acknowledge. 10 years I have spent in this city," Viktor said softly, almost to himself. "I have seen men of great stature wet themselves when I slide a business card across a desk. I have seen politicians trade their souls for a nod of my head. And yet, here is Hannah. Hannah, who is worried about the freshness of the pie and the rules of the walkway." He took a slow sip of the coffee, nodding in approval. "You have a policy, Hannah?" "I do," I replied, tucked the tray under my arm. "I serve the person who sits in the chair, not the reputation that follows them. Your coffee is $3. If you want to pay for a dare, you're at the wrong establishment." I turned on my heel and walked away, my spine straight, the heat of his gaze burning a hole between my shoulder blades. I could feel the entire diner exhaling as I reached the counter. My coworkers were staring, their faces pale, but I just grabbed a damp rag and started wiping the counter. I had asserted my rules. In this small, fluorescent-lit kingdom, the silver Fang was just another man who needed caffeine. The bell above the door chimed, a hollow, tinny sound that usually signaled the end of a rush, but tonight it felt like a warning. Viktor hadn't moved. He remained anchored in the booth, a silver-haired statue nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, but the energy in the diner had shifted. It wasn't just the silver Fang anymore. It was the air outside the windows, thick with the feeling of eyes that didn't belong to the law or the hungry. As I moved to the back to refill the napkin dispensers, I caught a glimpse of the street through the fogged glass of the side door. A dull gray sedan was idling at the curb, its headlights extinguished. It was parked in the red zone, oblivious to tickets, positioned with the calculated precision of a predator waiting for a gate to open. Inside, the glowing cherry of a cigarette pulsed rhythmically. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. I had lived in this neighborhood long enough to distinguish between a bored cop and a shadow. This was a shadow. Hannah. The voice was low, vibrating through the linoleum. I turned to find Viktor standing a few feet away, his bodyguards already fanning out toward the exit like a tactical unit. He hadn't touched the note. It was gone, vanished into the silk lining of his suit. He stepped closer, stepping into the light of the flickering fluorescent bulb. Up close, the silver Fang looked less like a boss and more like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. The gray coat, he said, his eyes flicking toward the window. He isn't mine. I held my tray like a shield, my knuckles whitening. I don't care whose he is, as long as he stays on the sidewalk. Viktor's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. There was a grim edge to it, a recognition. He's been there since I arrived. He's not watching me, Hannah. He's counting your steps. He's timing how long it takes for you to walk to the bus stop. The weight of his words hit me harder than any threat from his bodyguards. My ice wall was designed to handle the monsters inside my diner, the ones I could see and serve. But the danger was no longer contained by four walls and a menu. It had leaked onto the pavement. By refusing to flinch at the silver Fang, I had inadvertently painted a target on my own back for those who wanted to see him bleed. I can walk myself to the bus, I said, though my voice sounded thinner than it had 10 minutes ago. You could, Viktor agreed, buttoning his jacket. But you wouldn't make it past the alley. My invitation wasn't a threat, Hannah. It was a warning. There are people in this city who think that because you didn't tremble, you must be someone I cherish. In my world, a woman who isn't afraid is either an ally or an asset. He signaled to the door, and his men moved with silent, lethal grace. He paused at the threshold, the cold city wind whipping his hair. Finish your shift. Don't look at the car. And for God's sake, lock the back door. As the heavy glass door swung shut, I watched the gray sedan pull away from the curb, trailing Viktor's motorcade like a shark following a blood trail. The diner was empty now, the silence ringing in my ears. I reached out to wipe table 4, my hand finally betraying a slight, microscopic tremor. The dare wasn't just on the paper anymore. It was in the shadows, waiting for the lights to go out. The walk home felt like navigating a minefield. Every gust of wind rattling a trash can lid or the distant hum of a passing engine made my heart hammer against my ribs. I kept my eyes forward, my pace rhythmic and brisk, just as I always had, but the weight of the paper in my apron pocket felt like a lead weight pulling me toward the pavement. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief until I was inside my apartment, the 3 deadbolts on my door clicking into place with a finality that felt like a prayer. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I sat at my small kitchen table, the pale glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds and painting zebra stripes across the linoleum. I pulled the note out. My fingers finally trembled, a small, rhythmic shaking I couldn't suppress now that the audience was gone. I smoothed the paper out on the table. It wasn't a typed letter or a formal demand. It was a receipt from a defunct dry-cleaning business, Parker & Sons. My father's shop. The business that had burned down 12 years ago, taking his dreams and his health with it. On the back, in that same thick, uncompromising black ink, was a date from a decade ago and a single number, $50,000. Underneath it, a name was written in a hand that was elegant but sharp, like a razor blade wrapped in silk, Elias Parker. My breath hitched. My father had never mentioned a debt. He had died 3 years after the fire, claiming the insurance hadn't been enough to rebuild, but he'd always looked at me with a guilt I couldn't name. I realized now that the fire hadn't been an accident, and the insurance hadn't been from a company. It had been a loan from a man who went by the name Silver Fang. A second realization hit me, colder than the first. Viktor Petrov hadn't sought me out because he was hungry or bored. He had found the last living Parker. The "read it, I dare you" wasn't a taunt to a waitress. It was a subpoena to a daughter. He was holding the ghost of my father over my head, a debt of blood and interest that had been maturing in the dark for over a decade. I leaned back, the plastic chair creaking under my weight. Viktor had told me the shadow in the gray coat wasn't his. If the Silver Fang was the one holding the debt, then the man in the car was someone else, someone who didn't want the debt paid in cash, but in something far more permanent. I looked at the name Elias Parker and felt a surge of hot, defiant anger. My father had spent his life trying to keep me away from the shadows, and here they were, invited into my living room by a man with a signet ring and a smirk. The silence of the apartment was suddenly broken by the low, muffled vibration of a phone. Not my phone. I looked down at the floor. In the rush of the night, a small, black burner phone had been tucked into the folds of my apron. It was buzzing on the linoleum like a trapped insect. I picked it up. A single message glowed on the screen. "Now you know why you shouldn't have flinched." The next evening, the diner was a ghost of its former self. Word of the Silver Fang's visit had bled through the neighborhood, and the usual regulars had stayed home, leaving the booths empty and the air smelling of stale floor wax and anxiety. I was behind the counter, my fingers tracing the burner phone in my pocket, when the bell chimed. It wasn't the rhythmic, heavy entrance of Viktor Petrov. It was a frantic, discordant ringing as 4 men in gray coats pushed through the doors. They didn't sit. They moved with a jagged, nervous energy that was far more dangerous than Viktor's calculated calm. 2 of them stayed by the door, while the lead man, a wire-thin individual with a nervous twitch in his eye, kicked a chair out of his way. "Where is he?" the lead man demanded, his voice a high-pitched rasp. "Where's the Fang hiding his new favorite toy?" I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't hide. I grabbed a rag and began polishing a spot on the stainless steel counter. "Mr. Petrov isn't here. And if you're not ordering, you're trespassing." The man laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He pulled a serrated blade from his pocket and slammed it into the wooden countertop. "You've got a lot of nerve for a girl who's about to lose her pension. We saw him leave with you. We know he's coming back." Before I could respond, the back door, the one I'd locked just as Viktor warned, shuddered under a heavy blow. Viktor and his 2 shadows burst through the kitchen, their faces grim and splattered with rain. They were boxed in. The gray coats had the front, and the alley was crawling with more of them. Viktor's hand was already inside his jacket, his eyes darting across the room, calculating the angles of a gunfight that would leave none of us alive. "Hannah," Viktor said, his voice a low command. "Get behind the steel." "No," I whispered, stepping toward him. I knew this building better than the architects. I knew the secrets hidden under the grease and the linoleum. "If you fire a gun in here, the police station 2 blocks away will be here in 90 seconds. You won't make it out, and neither will I." I grabbed Viktor's sleeve, pulling him toward the heavy walk-in freezer at the back of the kitchen. The rival men were closing in, their boots thumping on the checkered floor. "The freezer?" Viktor hissed, his pride flickering even in the face of death. "I am not hiding in a meat locker." "It's not a locker," I snapped, reaching behind the industrial shelving where the heavy crates of produce were stacked. I found the rusted lever my boss had shown me on my first day, a remnant of the building's days as a Prohibition-era speakeasy. It's a service elevator for the basement coal chute. It comes out in the laundromat a block over. The shelving groaned as it swung open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. The front windows of the diner shattered as the gray coats finally lost their patience. Viktor looked at the hidden exit, then back at me. For the first time, the smirk was gone, replaced by a profound, silent realization. "Go," I urged, pushing him toward the dark. "I'll tell them you went out the roof." Viktor stepped into the shaft, but he paused, grabbing my hand. "Why help me, Hannah? After the note." Because you haven't paid my father's debt yet, I said, my voice hardening. And I don't let my customers leave without settling the bill. As the shelf clicked shut, I turned to face the men rushing into the kitchen, my hands empty, my heart steady, and my ice wall higher than it had ever been. The transition from the grease-stained floors of the diner to the cold, glass and steel heights of the Petrov estate felt like waking up in a different century. After the chaos at the diner, Viktor's men hadn't given me much of a choice. They hadn't used force, but the way they stood, silent, immovable, and radiating a quiet lethality, spoke volumes. I had helped this silver Fang escape, and in his world, that made me part of the inner circle, whether I liked it or not. We sat in the back of a black sedan that glided through the city like a predatory shark. Viktor remained silent, his gaze fixed on the passing neon lights of Seoul. The burner phone in my pocket felt heavier than ever. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a warehouse or a dock, but at a sprawling estate tucked away in the hills, guarded by gates that looked like they could withstand a tank. Viktor led me through the foyer, where the marble was so polished it looked like black water. Gold leaf accents caught the light of a chandelier that probably cost more than my father's dry-cleaning business ever made in a decade. He walked with the relaxed posture of a man who owned every atom of the air around him. He stopped in a cavernous study lined with leather-bound books that looked like they had never been opened. "This," Viktor said, gesturing with a slow, sweeping motion of his hand toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing city. "This is what $50,000 bought 12 years ago, Hannah. It was the seed. It was the price of survival. I didn't look at the view. I didn't look at the expensive art on the walls or the silk rugs beneath my feet. I walked to the center of the room, my sensible work shoes making a dull, unimpressed sound on the marble. I looked at him, and I saw the same man who had sat at table 4. "It's a lot of glass to clean," I said, my voice flat. Viktor turned, his brow furrowing. "You aren't even curious? Most people walk in here and lose their ability to speak. They see the power. They see the reach. I see a man who lives in a fortress because he's afraid of the street," I countered. I stepped closer, refusing to be dwarfed by the scale of his wealth. "You think this impresses me? My father had a shop that smelled like steam and hard work. People didn't come there because they were afraid. They came because he was the best at what he did. He didn't need guards to stand behind him while he ate his lunch." Viktor's expression hardened, the amusement finally dying in his eyes. He walked toward me until he was inches away, the scent of expensive cologne and old secrets surrounding us. "Your father was a good man, Hannah. But good men die in the dark. I made sure he didn't die in the street after that fire. I bought his silence, and I bought his safety. You bought his dignity," I corrected, my heart thumping but my face like stone. "And now you think you can buy mine by showing me a nice view. Keep your gold, Mr. Petrov. I'm still waiting for you to tell me why my name was on that list." For a moment, the silver Fang looked human. The mask slipped, revealing a flicker of exhaustion that no amount of money could hide. He reached into his desk and pulled out a file, sliding it toward me. "Because," he whispered, "you're the only one who doesn't want anything from me. And that makes you the only one I can trust to hold the keys." I opened the file with steady fingers, expecting to see a ledger of my father's sins or a list of demands. Instead, what I found was a series of surveillance photographs, but not of me. They were grainy, long-lens shots of men I didn't recognize, politicians shaking hands with the gray coats who had stormed the diner, and bank statements with highlighted discrepancies that suggested a massive internal theft. The name Elias Parker wasn't at the bottom of a debt sheet. It was at the top of a list of beneficiaries for a trust fund I never knew existed. "Your father didn't just take a loan to save his skin, Hannah," Viktor said, his voice dropping to a weary whisper. "He was my mentor. Long before I was the silver Fang, I was a runner for the docks, and he was the only man who treated me like a human being. When the fire happened, I didn't just give him money. I gave him a piece of the empire to hold in trust. I knew my world would eventually try to eat me alive, and I needed someone outside the life to keep the core of my assets safe." I looked up from the file, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin. "You put my father in the middle of a Mafia war. I put him in a position of power he didn't want, but he did it to ensure you would never have to work a night shift in your life, Viktor countered. He stepped toward me, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. But he died, and the men behind me, the ones you saw tonight, know that the Parker Trust is the only thing standing between them and total control of this city. They thought they could scare you into signing it over. They thought a waitress wouldn't know what she was holding. He reached out, not to touch me, but to tap the file. I didn't slide that note across the table to threaten you. I did it to see if you were like him. I needed to know if you had the spine to stand your ground when the wolves started circling. Every person in this house, every bodyguard at that diner, they all lie to me. They tell me what I want to hear because they fear the Fang. But you? You looked at me like I was a man who forgot to pay his tab. I closed the file, the ice wall I had spent years building finally showing its first real cracks. This wasn't a story about a debt. It was a story about a legacy. My father hadn't been a victim. He had been a guardian. I don't want your money, Viktor, I said, my voice finally wavering. It's not about the money anymore, he replied, his gaze intense. It's about the fact that they know who you are now. The note was an invitation, Hannah. An invitation to step into the light and claim what's yours before they take it by force. I don't need a waitress, and I don't need a victim. I need the only person in this city who doesn't flinch when I look at them. The burner phone in my pocket buzzed again. I pulled it out and showed him the screen. We're coming for the girl. Viktor's face shifted, the mask of the silver Fang locking back into place. Let them come, he growled. They have no idea who they're dealing with. The black sedan didn't head back toward the safety of the estate. Instead, it tore through the winding roads toward the Han River, the engine a low, rhythmic growl that drowned out the sound of the rain. Viktor sat beside me, his profile carved from stone in the flashing light of the passing street lamps. He wasn't hiding me. He was parading me. He was taking the weakness his enemies thought they had found and turning it into a flag of war. We pulled over at the edge of the Bampo Bridge, the vast expanse of the river churning like liquid lead below us. 3 other cars were already there, their headlights cutting through the mist to illuminate a line of men in gray coats. The leader, the one who had slammed his blade into my counter, stood at the center, his face twisted in a mixture of greed and disbelief. Viktor stepped out of the car, and for the first time, I didn't stay behind the glass. I opened my door and stepped out into the freezing wind, standing exactly 3 inches to his left. I didn't hide behind his bodyguards. I stood with my hands clasped in front of me, my white blouse a stark, defiant contrast to the sea of dark suits. You brought her, the man in the gray coat sneered, his hand twitching toward his waistband. You're more of a fool than we thought, Petrov, bringing the key right to the door. I didn't bring a key, Viktor said, his voice carrying over the roar of the water with terrifying clarity. I brought the owner. You've spent weeks chasing a ghost, thinking a waitress was a target. You thought that because she was a Parker, she was something to be taken. Viktor reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of protection, it was a gesture of introduction. Look at her, he commanded, his eyes locking onto his rival. Does she look like she's afraid of you? Does she look like someone who flinches when the wind blows? The men in gray hesitated. They were used to seeing people crumble, to seeing the assets of the underworld weep or beg. But I just stood there, letting the rain soak through my clothes, staring at them with the same unimpressed gaze I used on drunk customers at 3 in the morning. My father had stood his ground in a burning building. I could stand mine on a bridge. The Parker Trust isn't a debt, I said, my voice steady and cold. It's a wall. And as of tonight, it's closed to you. If you want to get to the Silver Fang's assets, you have to go through me. And I don't serve people like you. Viktor stepped forward, the Silver Fang, fully unleashed. She is off limits, he growled. Not because she belongs to me, but because she is the only person in this city with the soul to tell me no. If you touch a hair on her head, I won't just kill you. I'll erase the memory of you. The rivals looked from Viktor's lethal promise to my unshakable silence. Slowly, the man in the gray coat lowered his hand. He recognized a different kind of power, the kind that didn't need a gun to make a point. As they retreated into their cars and disappeared into the night, Viktor turned to me, the rain dripping off his jaw. "You're a terrible waitress, Hannah," he whispered. "You're far too good at making people lose their appetite." The drive back from the bridge was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the previous night. The heater in the sedan hummed, struggling against the damp chill clinging to our clothes. Viktor sat beside me, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked window. He looked less like a kingpin and more like a man who had finally dropped a weight he'd been carrying for 12 years. When we reached my apartment building, he didn't send a bodyguard to open my door. He did it himself. We stood under the flickering yellow light of the entryway, the city's distant sirens providing a jagged soundtrack to the moment. My ice wall, the one that had kept me safe through double shifts, city living, and the grief of my father's passing, felt thinner than ever. "They won't come back tonight," Viktor said, his voice low and raspy. "But they're still out there, Hannah. The trust is a shield, but a shield is heavy. You shouldn't have to carry it alone." I leaned against the brick wall, my arms crossed. I looked at the black car, the shadows of his men, and then back at him. "I've spent my whole life being told what I need, Viktor. My father wanted to protect me by hiding the truth. You wanted to protect me by parading me on a bridge. Everyone wants to be the hero in my story, but nobody asks if I want to play the damsel." I stepped closer until I was looking up into those gray eyes that had seen too much blood and too little peace. "I'm not a target, and I'm not a Parker Trust beneficiary. I'm Hannah, and if we're going to do this, if we're going to survive whatever comes next, it's not going to be on your terms." Viktor tilted his head, a ghost of that smirk returning, but this time it was tempered with genuine respect. "And what are your terms?" "No more dares," I said, my voice firm. "No more sliding notes across tables to test me. If you're in trouble, you tell me. If there's a threat, we face it together. I'm not your weakness, Viktor. I'm your partner. And partners don't flinch, but they don't lie either." For the first time since I'd met him, the silver Fang didn't have a witty retort or a commanding order. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "No more dares," he repeated. "Just the truth." I reached out, and for the first time, I was the one to bridge the gap. I placed my hand on his arm, not to be led, but to anchor him. The ice wall didn't shatter, it just opened a door. I didn't need a savior, and he didn't need a subject. We were just two people who had found the only other person in the world who could look them in the eye without blinking. "Good," I said, finally letting a small, tired smile touch my lips. "Now, get some sleep, Mr. Petrov. You look like you're about to fall over, and I have a shift in the morning." As I turned to head up the stairs, I heard the car door close. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. For the first time in a long time, the shadows didn't feel like they were closing in. They felt like they were standing guard. The following night, the diner was different. The heavy, suffocating tension that had defined the last week had evaporated, replaced by a cautious, humming stillness. This silver Fang was no longer a ghost story haunting table 4. He was a man sitting in a booth, and for the first time, he didn't have two shadows looming behind him. He had come alone. I walked over to his table, the familiar clinking of the diner's silverware sounding like a peaceful rhythm rather than a countdown. I didn't wait for him to acknowledge me, and I didn't wait for a dare. I simply set a fresh cup of coffee in front of him and sat down in the opposite bench. Viktor looked at me, his eyes searching my face for the ice wall I usually kept between us. He found it gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable resolve. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a note or a receipt. He pulled out a small, old-fashioned key, rusted at the edges but solid, and placed it on the table between us. "The shop," he said, his voice devoid of the gravelly theater he used for his enemies. "Your father's dry-cleaning business. I never sold the land, Hannah. I couldn't. It felt like selling the only part of my life that wasn't covered in blood." I looked at the key, then back at him. "Why give it to me now?" "Because a circle isn't complete until it returns to where it started," Viktor replied. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "The trust is yours. The legacy is yours. But the agreement we made on the bridge, that belongs to both of us. No more dares." No more secrets. If I am the sword of this city, you are the conscience. We are equals, or we are nothing. I reached out and placed my hand over the key, my fingers brushing against his. It wasn't a gesture of submission, and it wasn't a romantic cliché. It was a signature. It was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another where the waitress didn't have to hide and the boss didn't have to rule alone. I'm still keeping my shift, I said, a small smirk playing on my lips. Someone has to make sure you pay your tab. Viktor laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to startle even him. I wouldn't dream of leaving without paying, Hannah. I think I'll be a regular for a very long time. As I stood up to return to the counter, the bell above the door chimed. A group of late-shift workers walked in, laughing and complaining about the cold. The world was moving again. The shadows were still there, tucked away in the corners of the city, but they no longer felt like a threat. They felt like a background. I looked back at table 4. Viktor was sipping his coffee, watching the room with a calm I had never seen in him before. He caught my eye and gave a small, respectful nod. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, grabbed my tray, and went back to work. The silver Fang and the waitress were gone. In their place were 2 partners, ready to face whatever the city threw at them next.